When you first see Luke Skywalker staring at the twin suns of Tatooine, yearning for something more than the life of a moisture farmer stretching endlessly before him, you're witnessing the beginning of one of the greatest hero's journeys ever told. This restless farm boy, orphaned at birth, raised by his aunt and uncle on a remote desert planet far from the centers of galactic power, dreams of adventure, of piloting ships through the stars, of a life that matters beyond the endless drudgery of vaporator maintenance and harvest quotas. He has no idea that his father was once the greatest Jedi Knight in the galaxy. He doesn't know that his destiny will shape the fate of trillions. He can't imagine that one day he'll face the Emperor himself in a confrontation that will determine whether darkness or light prevails across the entire galaxy. But the Force has plans for Luke Skywalker, and destiny has a way of finding those it needs. This is Luke Skywalker, the last hope of the Jedi Order, the hero who destroyed 2 Death Stars, the son who redeemed Darth Vader, the master who tried to rebuild what was lost and paid the price for his failure. His story spans from hidden birth during the Empire's darkest hour through legendary victories, devastating mistakes, exile driven by shame, and final redemption as a Force ghost guiding new generations. To understand Luke is to understand hope itself, to see how an ordinary person can become extraordinary when they choose to act with courage and compassion. To recognize that even heroes fail, but that failure doesn't define them if they learn and grow from it. Luke Skywalker is the heart of Star Wars, the character through whose eyes we first entered this universe, and his journey from farm boy to legend embodies everything the saga has taught us about the power of choice, the strength found in compassion, and the eternal struggle between light and darkness. The story begins in the final days of the Clone Wars, in 19 before the Battle of Yavin, when the Republic was collapsing and the Jedi Order was being systematically exterminated. Padme Amidala, senator of Naboo and secret wife of Anakin Skywalker, was 9 months pregnant with twins. Her husband had fallen to the dark side, seduced by Palpatine's promises of power to save her from death. On the asteroid of Polis Massa, in a medical facility where survivors fled after Order 66, Padme gave birth to Luke and Leia even as her will to live faded. She'd seen what Anakin had become, had confronted him on Mustafar, and been force-choked for her refusal to join him in darkness. The medical droids couldn't explain why she was dying. Physically, she should have survived. But something in her had broken when Anakin turned, and she couldn't find the strength to continue. With her last breaths, Padme named her children, Luke and Leia. The twins she'd carried through months of hiding Anakin's fall, through the transformation of the Republic into the Empire, through the destruction of everything she'd fought to protect. She told Obi-Wan Kenobi, who'd carried her from Mustafar after Anakin's defeat, that there was still good in Anakin, that she knew it, that somehow he could be saved. Then she died, leaving her infant children orphaned, their father transformed into Darth Vader, believing he'd killed his wife in his anger, unaware that his children had survived. Yoda and Obi-Wan made the difficult decision to separate the twins. Together, they were too powerful, too noticeable through the Force. The Emperor and Vader would sense them, would hunt them, would either kill them or corrupt them into servants of the dark side. Apart, hidden, they might survive undetected long enough to grow strong, to perhaps one day challenge the Sith who now ruled the galaxy. Leia was adopted by Bail Organa, senator of Alderaan and trusted friend of Padme, raised as a princess in the royal house with every advantage wealth and education could provide. Luke was taken to Tatooine, to the Lars homestead, to be raised by Anakin's stepbrother Owen Lars and his wife Beru. The choice of Tatooine was deliberate and risky. It was Anakin's home world, the planet where he'd been born into slavery, where his mother had died in his arms. Vader hated Tatooine, associated it with his painful past, had no desire to return. That hatred made it the perfect hiding place. The last place Vader would look for his children was the first place he'd want to forget. Owen and Beru agreed to raise Luke as their nephew, to hide his true parentage, to keep him safe from the Empire and from the legacy of his father. They would give him a simple life, a normal childhood, far from the wars and intrigues that had destroyed his parents' generation. Obi-Wan settled nearby, taking the name Ben Kenobi, living as a hermit in the Jundland wastes. He watched over Luke from a distance, ready to intervene if the boy was threatened, prepared to train him when the time was right. But Owen wanted no part of Obi-Wan's protection, no connection to the Jedi or their doomed crusades. He'd seen what the life of a Jedi had done to Anakin, how it had led to his corruption and fall. He wouldn't let Luke follow that path. When Obi-Wan occasionally tried to visit, to check on the boy he'd sworn to protect, Owen turned him away. Luke would be a farmer, not a warrior. He would live in peace, far from the Force and destiny and all the grand designs that got people killed. Luke's early childhood was largely peaceful and uneventful. He grew up in the harsh environment of Tatooine's desert, learning to repair moisture evaporators, helping with the farm work, enduring the twin suns' brutal heat and the occasional sandstorm. The Lars homestead was isolated, hours from Mos Eisley or any other settlement, surrounded by empty dunes and the constant threat of Tusken raiders. It was a hard life, but not a cruel one. Owen was strict but fair, believing discipline built character. Beru was warm, providing the maternal love Luke needed, telling him stories about his father that painted Anakin as a navigator on a spice freighter, killed in the Clone Wars, nothing special or remarkable. One significant incident disrupted Luke's childhood when he was 10 years old. The third sister, an inquisitor named Reva Savanda, tracked Obi-Wan to Tatooine. Her pursuit led to the Lars homestead, where she kidnapped Luke, intending to use the boy as bait to lure out the Jedi she hunted. Obi-Wan came immediately, fought through Imperial forces to rescue Luke, and in the process revealed himself to Vader, drawing his former apprentice away from Tatooine. The incident was traumatic for young Luke, but Owen and Beru worked hard to help him forget, to minimize the event's impact, to return him to the simple life they'd planned for him. Luke never remembered meeting Obi-Wan during that rescue. The memories were too fragmented, too confused by fear and stress. He continued growing up believing Ben Kenobi was just a strange old hermit who lived out in the wastes, someone to avoid, eccentric at best, and possibly dangerous. Owen reinforced this perception, warning Luke to stay away from Kenobi, suggesting the old man was crazy, that nothing good would come from association with him. The warning had the opposite effect of making Luke curious, but he generally obeyed, focusing instead on his duties on the farm and his dreams of escape. As Luke entered his teenage years, the restlessness grew. He was bright, mechanically talented, capable of fixing almost any machine with intuitive understanding that bordered on supernatural. He could pilot anything, had reflexes that let him navigate Beggar's Canyon in his T-16 Skyhopper at speeds that should have been impossible. His friends, Biggs Darklighter and others from the nearby settlements, all planned to leave Tatooine eventually, to join the Imperial Academy or find work off-world. Luke wanted desperately to join them, to escape the monotony of moisture farming, to see the galaxy beyond the desert that had been his entire world. But Owen always had reasons why Luke couldn't leave. Next season, maybe. After the harvest, when he was older, when the farm was more established. The excuses piled up year after year, and Luke began to understand that Owen had no intention of ever letting him go. His uncle feared what would happen if Luke left Tatooine, feared he'd be drawn into the conflicts that had consumed his father, feared losing him the way Shmi had lost Anakin. The protectiveness was born from love, but felt like imprisonment to Luke, who couldn't understand why he was being held back when he was capable of so much more. Luke's connection to the Force was present, but untrained. He experienced it as exceptional reflexes, as instinctive understanding of machinery, as occasional premonitions that proved accurate. He didn't know. These abilities came from the Force, didn't have the framework to understand what he was experiencing. When he threaded his skyhopper through impossible gaps in the canyon walls, when he knew where to look to find a malfunction in equipment, when he sensed danger moments before it arrived, he attributed it to luck or skill. The Force worked through him unconsciously, protecting him, guiding him, preparing him for the destiny approaching with every passing day. The year Luke turned 19, everything changed. Owen decided to purchase new droids to help with the harvest. The Jawas brought a selection, and among them were C-3PO and R2-D2, droids who'd served Luke's parents, who'd been present at his birth, who carried a message that would tear apart the simple life Owen had tried to build. Luke helped select the droids, choosing a red R2 unit initially before it malfunctioned, leading to R2-D2 being included in the purchase. He cleaned the droids that evening, preparing them for work, when R2-D2 accidentally played part of a holographic message. The hologram showed a woman, beautiful and desperate, her image flickering as she spoke. "Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi. You're my only hope." The message repeated, truncated, giving no context beyond the plea for help. Luke was fascinated, asking about Obi-Wan Kenobi, wondering if she meant Ben Kenobi, the hermit from the wastes. C-3PO denied knowledge of any Obi-Wan, but the seed was planted. Luke's curiosity, always his defining trait, was engaged. Who was this woman? Why did she need help? What was Obi-Wan Kenobi to her? That night, R2-D2 escaped, determined to fulfill his mission of delivering the message to Obi-Wan. Luke discovered the escape the next morning and set out with C-3PO to recover the droid, knowing Owen would be furious about the loss. The search led them into the Jundland wastes, dangerous territory frequented by Tusken raiders. Luke found R2-D2 but was immediately attacked by a Tusken scouting party. They knocked him unconscious, were preparing to scavenge his skyhopper when a sound echoed through the canyon, the cry of a crate dragon, the most fearsome predator on Tatooine. The Tuskens fled immediately, terrified of encountering such a creature. Except there was no crate dragon. It was Ben Kenobi, using the Force to mimic the creature's roar, scaring away the Tuskens to protect Luke. When Luke regained consciousness, he found the old hermit watching over him, C-3PO and R2-D2 nearby, safe. Ben suggested they go to his home, that it wasn't safe to remain in the open. Luke agreed, still dazed from the attack, curious about this man his uncle had warned him away from for years. At Ben's small dwelling, carved into the rock of the wastes, Luke's life changed forever. Ben explained that he hadn't gone by the name Obi-Wan Kenobi for many years, that it was a name from his past. But he confirmed he was who Luke suspected, the person the message was intended for. He watched the full hologram, the plea from Princess Leia Organa of Alderaan, asking Obi-Wan to bring R2-D2 to her father on Alderaan, claiming the droid contained information vital to the rebellion. Ben looked sad, acknowledging the message represented calls for help he'd chosen not to answer for nearly 2 decades. Luke asked about his father, saying Owen told him Anakin had been a navigator on a spice freighter. Ben laughed, called it true from a certain point of view, then told Luke the truth. Anakin Skywalker had been a Jedi Knight, a warrior with powers Luke could barely imagine, one of the best starfighter pilots in the galaxy, and a good friend. He'd fought in the Clone Wars alongside Obi-Wan, had been a hero, but he'd been betrayed and murdered by Darth Vader, a Sith Lord who'd been Obi-Wan's former apprentice, one of the Emperor's chief enforcers. The revelation stunned Luke, who'd grown up believing his father was nobody special, just another victim of the wars that had consumed his generation. Learning he'd been a Jedi, that he'd mattered, that there was more to Luke's heritage than moisture farming, opened possibilities Luke had never imagined. Ben gave Luke his father's lightsaber, the elegant weapon of a more civilized age. The blade was blue, the hilt perfectly balanced, humming with power when ignited. Luke held it with reverence, feeling connection to the father he'd never known, to a legacy that suddenly seemed within reach. Ben suggested Luke come with him to Alderaan, that he should learn the ways of the Force as his father had, that he had potential that shouldn't be wasted on moisture farming. Luke hesitated, torn between excitement at the opportunity and obligation to his uncle. He couldn't just leave. Owen needed him for the harvest. Maybe after that, maybe later, maybe when the time was right. The decision was taken from him. While Luke was with Ben, stormtroopers searching for the droids tracked them to the Jawa sandcrawler that had sold C-3PO and R2-D2 to Owen. The Imperials slaughtered the Jawas, burned the sandcrawler, then followed the trail to the Lars homestead. Owen and Beru refused to reveal information about the droids or where Luke had gone. The stormtroopers killed them both, burned their bodies, left them as scorched skeletons outside the home Luke had grown up in. When Luke returned and found the devastation, found his aunt and uncle murdered, his entire world collapsed in a moment. He had nothing left on Tatooine, no family, no home, no reason to stay in the desert that had been his prison. Ben had offered him a path forward, a chance to learn about the Force, to understand his father's legacy, to become something more than he'd been. Luke accepted, agreeing to go to Alderaan, to help deliver R2-D2's message, to perhaps join the rebellion and fight against the Empire that had murdered the only parents he'd ever known. It was the beginning of a journey that would transform a naive farm boy into the galaxy's greatest hope. They needed transport off Tatooine. Ben knew of a smuggler operating out of Mos Eisley, a Corellian named Han Solo, who captained a ship called the Millennium Falcon. Mos Eisley was dangerous, full of criminals and Imperial agents, but it was also the best place to find someone willing to transport passengers without asking too many questions. They entered the city, made their way to the cantina where pilots and smugglers gathered. Imperial stormtroopers were everywhere, searching for droids matching R2-D2 and C-3PO's descriptions. Ben used a Jedi mind trick on troopers who stopped them, convincing them through the Force that these weren't the droids they were looking for. Luke watched in amazement as the technique worked perfectly, the troopers letting them pass without further question. In the cantina, they met Han Solo and his Wookiee co-pilot Chewbacca. Han was cocky, confident, clearly more interested in credits than causes. He initially wanted 10,000 for passage to Alderaan, a sum far beyond what Ben could offer. They settled on 2,000 up front and 15,000 upon arrival, payment Luke promised they'd receive from Leia's father. Han was skeptical but agreed, needing money to pay off Jabba the Hutt, a crime lord Han owed significant debts to after dumping cargo to avoid Imperial inspection. They arranged to meet at Docking Bay 94, where the Millennium Falcon was berthed. The journey to the Falcon was tense. Stormtroopers had been alerted to their presence, and the city was on lockdown. They fought their way through the streets, Ben using his lightsaber for the first time in Luke's presence, cutting through threats with practiced ease. Luke saw what a Jedi could do in combat, the speed and precision, the way the Force guided Ben's movements. It was everything he'd dreamed of and more, validation that the galaxy contained wonders beyond Tatooine's desert. They reached the Falcon just ahead of pursuing stormtroopers, boarded quickly as Han fired up the engines. Han's piloting during the escape was extraordinary. The Falcon, despite looking like a piece of junk, was one of the fastest ships in the galaxy. Han had made numerous modifications, pushing the vessel's performance far beyond factory specifications. He threaded through Mos Eisley's streets at impossible speeds, dodged stormtrooper fire, evaded pursuing TIE fighters, then jumped to hyperspace before Imperial Star Destroyers could capture them in tractor beams. Luke watched from the cockpit, amazed by Han's skill, by the casual confidence with which the smuggler performed maneuvers that should have been fatal. Flying had always been Luke's passion, his escape from farm work. Watching Han fly gave him aspirations, showed him what true mastery looked like. On the journey to Alderaan, Ben began Luke's training in the Force. He gave Luke a training remote, a small sphere that fired low-power blasts, teaching him to deflect them with the lightsaber. The exercise seemed impossible at first. Luke relied on his eyes, on reflexes, on conscious thought. The remote was too fast, the blasts coming from unexpected angles. Ben placed a helmet on Luke's head with the blast shield down, obscuring his vision, forcing him to rely on something beyond sight. "Your eyes can deceive you," Ben warned. "Don't trust them. Stretch out with your feelings." Luke tried, failed repeatedly, grew frustrated. But then something clicked. He stopped thinking, stopped analyzing, let his instincts guide him. The Force flowed through him, showing him where the next blast would come from, guiding his lightsaber to intercept. He deflected several shots successfully, felt the exhilaration of touching something vast and powerful that connected all living things. Ben smiled, pleased with the progress, explaining that Luke had taken his first step into a larger world. The training was brief, barely an introduction, but it planted seeds that would grow throughout Luke's journey. The arrival at Alderaan was devastating. They exited hyperspace to find debris where the planet should have been, asteroids that had been mountains and cities and billions of lives, now reduced to rubble. The Death Star had been there, had tested its super laser on Alderaan, had destroyed the entire planet as a demonstration of Imperial power. Leia's homeworld, the destination they'd been racing toward, was gone. Everyone on it, including Bail Organa and his wife, murdered. Luke felt the disturbance through the Force, the echo of billions dying simultaneously, a wound in the living energy that bound the galaxy. The Millennium Falcon was caught in a tractor beam projected by the Death Star, pulled toward the massive space station against Han's efforts to escape. They had no choice but to allow the capture, preparing to fight their way out or die trying. But when the Imperials boarded the Falcon to search it, they found it apparently empty. Han, Luke, Chewbacca, Ben, and the droids had hidden in smuggling compartments built into the Falcon's floor, spaces designed to avoid Imperial inspections. The boarding party left, believing the ship was simply a deserted vessel that had been adrift in the debris field. Emerging from hiding, they realized they were trapped in the heart of Imperial power, aboard the Empire's ultimate weapon, with no clear escape plan. Ben proposed they should shut down the tractor beam, allowing the Falcon to escape. He left to find the controls, instructing the others to wait. But R2-D2 accessed the Death Star's computers through a terminal port and discovered that Princess Leia was being held prisoner in detention block AA-23. She was scheduled for execution. Luke couldn't stand by, couldn't leave her to die when they had the chance to rescue her. Han protested that it was suicide, that they should focus on escaping. Luke convinced him by pointing out the reward Leia's rescue would earn. Han's greed overcame his survival instincts, and they set out to rescue the princess. The rescue was chaotic, improvised, succeeding more through luck and desperation than planning. Luke and Han disguised themselves in stolen stormtrooper armor, claimed to be transferring Chewbacca to cell block 1138, fought their way into the detention level when the deception failed. Luke found Leia's cell and released her, expecting gratitude. Instead, the princess was sarcastic, unimpressed by the rescue attempt, immediately taking charge when she realized her rescuers had no coherent escape plan. She grabbed a blaster and started giving orders, leading them into a garbage chute when stormtroopers overwhelmed their position. The chute led to a trash compactor filled with water and refuse. They barely had time to register their surroundings before the walls began closing, crushing everything between them. Luke was pulled underwater by a Dianoga, a tentacled creature that lived in the waste. He escaped its grip only to face the larger threat of being crushed. R2-D2 managed to stop the compactor at the last possible moment, saving them all. They escaped the garbage bay, fought through corridors filled with stormtroopers, Han and Leia bickering constantly while Luke tried to keep them focused on survival. Their path back to the Falcon led past a massive hangar where Darth Vader stood waiting. Ben was there, lightsaber ignited, facing his former apprentice in a final confrontation. Luke wanted to help, to fight alongside the man who'd become his mentor in just a few short days. But Ben didn't need help. He needed Luke to escape, to survive, to grow into the Jedi who might one day challenge the Sith. As Luke and the others reached the Falcon, as Han provided covering fire and they prepared to board, Ben saw them. He deactivated his lightsaber and allowed Vader to strike him down, his body disappearing, leaving only empty robes. Luke screamed, tried to rush back, had to be pulled aboard the Falcon by Han as the ship lifted off. They escaped the Death Star, though Imperial forces let them go deliberately. Vader had placed a tracking beacon on the Falcon, knowing they would lead the Empire directly to the Rebel base. The plan worked perfectly. The Falcon jumped to hyperspace, headed for the Rebel headquarters on Yavin 4, and the Death Star followed at a discreet distance, preparing to destroy the rebellion in a single, devastating attack. Luke grieved Ben's death during the journey, unable to process losing his mentor so soon after losing Owen and Beru, feeling abandoned and lost. But then Ben's voice came to him, echoing in his mind, telling him the Force would be with him. Always. The Jedi could become one with the Force after death, retaining consciousness and identity, able to guide and counsel those they'd left behind. Ben wasn't truly gone. He'd simply transcended physical existence. Arriving at Yavin 4, they delivered the Death Star plans that R2-D2 had been, carrying the information that might allow the rebels to destroy the station. Analysis revealed a vulnerability. A thermal exhaust port led directly to the main reactor. A precise shot down the shaft would trigger a chain reaction destroying the station. But the target was tiny, 2 meters across, shielded by defensive turrets. Only a direct hit with proton torpedoes would work, and the shot would have to be made while flying at high speed through a trench, under fire from TIE fighters and the station's own defenses. The mission was nearly impossible. Most of the pilots briefed on it believed they were being sent to die. Luke volunteered immediately. He was one of the best pilots the rebels had, despite his lack of combat experience. His skills in Beggar's Canyon, flying his T-16 Skyhopper through terrain that killed most who attempted it, translated directly to starfighter combat. He understood instinctively how to push a craft to its limits, how to thread through impossible spaces, how to outfly opponents who should have been able to kill him. The Force enhanced these natural talents, giving him reflexes and precognition that made him exceptional. The rebellion, desperate for any advantage, allowed him to fly despite his youth and inexperience. The Battle of Yavin was Luke's first true test as a warrior and as an emerging Jedi. He flew a T-65B X-Wing starfighter, Red 5, as part of Red Squadron. The attack on the Death Star involved multiple fighter groups, Y-Wings carrying the heavy ordnance attempting initial runs, while X-Wings provided escort and engaged TIE fighters. Luke watched as ship after ship was destroyed, experienced pilots killed by overwhelming Imperial defenses. The trench run was a kill zone. Pilots who attempted it were destroyed before they could fire their torpedoes. The Death Star was charging its super laser, preparing to fire on Yavin 4. If the rebels failed to destroy it in the next few minutes, the station would eliminate the rebel base and everyone on it. Luke made his trench run with Biggs Darklighter and Wedge Antilles as his wingmen, Han having departed after receiving his payment, unwilling to die in what he considered a futile gesture. The run was everything Luke feared and more. TIE fighters attacked from behind, their laser fire destroying ships on either side of him. Biggs was killed protecting Luke, his X-Wing exploding as he tried to cover his friend's approach. Wedge was damaged and forced to withdraw. Luke was alone, approaching the exhaust port, targeting computer calculating the optimal firing solution, when Darth Vader himself arrived. Vader's TIE Advanced targeted Luke's X-Wing with devastating precision. The Dark Lord's piloting skills were legendary, and he'd identified Luke as the most dangerous of the remaining rebel pilots. Vader lined up the killing shot, his finger tightening on the trigger, when the Millennium Falcon appeared. Han had returned, unable to abandon his new friends to certain death. The Falcon's guns destroyed one of Vader's wingmen, sending the second careening into Vader's TIE, knocking the Sith Lord spinning out of control into space, eliminating the threat to Luke. Luke had a clear shot at the exhaust port. His targeting computer provided precise firing solution. But Ben's voice echoed in his mind. "Use the Force, Luke. Let go." Luke turned off the targeting computer, trusting the Force instead of technology, letting instinct guide him. He felt the right moment, fired his proton torpedoes, watched them disappear down the shaft. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the explosions began, chain reactions spreading through the Death Star's interior, building toward catastrophic failure. Luke pulled up and accelerated, racing away from the station as it detonated behind him, destroyed in a massive fireball that lit up space. The victory was complete. The Death Star was destroyed. The rebellion had survived. Luke had saved them all, a farm boy from Tatooine who a few days earlier had been cleaning moisture evaporators, now the hero of the rebellion's greatest triumph. The celebration on Yavin 4 was bittersweet for Luke. He'd won a great victory but lost so much. Ben was dead. Biggs was dead. Owen and Beru were dead. But Leia lived. The rebellion lived. The Empire had suffered its first major defeat. Hope existed where before there had been only despair. Princess Leia presented Luke with a medal in a ceremony celebrating the victory. Han receiving one as well, the two heroes of the Battle of Yavin recognized for their courage. But the war was far from over. The years between the Battle of Yavin and the Battle of Hoth were formative for Luke, transforming him from lucky farm boy into genuine warrior and emerging Jedi. He continued flying missions for the rebellion, participating in countless engagements against Imperial forces, refining his piloting skills through combat experience. But more importantly, he began seriously training in the Force, studying what little Jedi knowledge remained, trying to develop his abilities without a living master to guide him. Ben's Force ghost appeared occasionally, offering wisdom and encouragement, but these manifestations were brief and cryptic. Luke had to figure out most things himself, learning through trial and error, through meditation and practice, through touching the Force, and slowly understanding its nature. His connection to the Force grew stronger with each passing month. He could sense danger before it arrived, could influence weak-minded individuals through suggestion, could move small objects with his mind through concentrated effort. The abilities came naturally, as though his body remembered what his conscious mind had never learned. His father's bloodline, the Chosen One's legacy flowing through his veins, gave Luke potential that exceeded most Force sensitives. But potential meant nothing without training, without discipline, without understanding how to properly channel the power he possessed. Luke studied obsessively, reading any ancient texts the rebellion had managed to preserve, meditating for hours, pushing himself to master techniques that seemed impossible. His relationship with Leia deepened during this period, though neither understood the true nature of their connection. They were drawn to each other, felt comfortable in ways that transcended normal attraction, shared an instinctive understanding that went beyond words. Luke believed he was falling in love with her. Leia cared for him deeply, but was increasingly drawn to Han Solo, despite the smuggler's infuriating arrogance and her own reluctance to admit feelings for someone so fundamentally different from herself. the triangle created tension, particularly between Luke and Han, who'd become friends but also rivals for Leia's affection. Neither man knew that Luke and Leia were siblings, that the connection they felt was familial rather than romantic, that the Force itself was pushing them together because they were two halves of a whole. The rebellion established a new base on Hoth, an ice planet in the Outer Rim, after the Empire discovered their Yavin 4 location. Hoth was miserable, frozen, barely habitable, but its remoteness provided security. The rebels built Echo Base inside the ice, using natural caverns and carved spaces, creating a facility that could house thousands of personnel and their equipment. Luke was stationed there with Rogue Squadron, the elite starfighter unit he'd joined after Yavin, continuing his service as one of the rebellion's best pilots, while also serving as commander. Life on Hoth was harsh, but relatively safe for the first months, allowing the rebellion to regroup, to plan their next moves, to build strength for continued resistance against the Empire. During a patrol mission, Luke was attacked by a Wampa, a massive ice predator that dragged him back to its cave for feeding. The creature hung him upside down from the ceiling, and Luke drifted in and out of consciousness, suffering from both his injuries and the brutal cold. In his delirium, he saw Ben's Force ghost, heard his old mentor's voice instructing him to go to Dagobah to find the Jedi Master Yoda who would train him. Luke barely understood the message, focused on surviving the immediate crisis. He used the Force to pull his lightsaber to his hand, cut himself free from the ice, and severed the Wampa's arm when it attacked. Escaping into the blizzard, injured and disoriented, Luke collapsed in the snow. Han found him before he froze to death, using Luke's Tauntaun mount to create a shelter until rescue arrived the next morning. The experience reinforced for Luke how much he still had to learn, how vulnerable he remained, despite his growing abilities. A simple creature had nearly killed him. How could he hope to face the Empire's truly dangerous enemies? The vision of Ben, the instruction to find, Yoda stayed with him. When the Empire eventually discovered Echo Base and launched a full-scale assault, when the rebels were forced to evacuate, Luke knew where he needed to go. The Battle of Hoth was devastating for the rebellion. The Empire arrived with overwhelming force, Star Destroyers and AT-AT walkers, and thousands of troops. The rebels fought desperately to buy time for evacuation, using their limited resources against the Imperial war machine. Luke led Rogue Squadron's Snowspeeder contingent against the AT-ATs, the massive four-legged walkers that were nearly impervious to standard weapons. He developed a tactic of using tow cables to trip the walkers, wrapping cables around their legs and toppling them onto the ice. The technique worked, destroying several walkers, buying crucial time for transports to escape. But Echo Base fell nonetheless. The Empire breached the main entrance, stormed through the base, forced the rebels into full retreat. Luke escaped with R2-D2 in his X-Wing, while Han, Leia, Chewbacca, and C-3PO fled in the Millennium Falcon, pursued by Darth Vader's Star Destroyer. The rebellion scattered across the galaxy, its headquarters destroyed, its forces fractured. Luke set course for Dagobah, trusting Ben's vision, hoping that this mysterious Yoda could provide the training he desperately needed. Dagobah was unlike any world Luke had encountered. The entire planet was swamp, covered in dense vegetation, shrouded in fog, saturated with the Force to a degree that made his instruments malfunction. Landing was difficult, his X-Wing crashing into a murky bog, sinking partially into the water. Luke waded ashore with R2-D2, immediately uncomfortable in the oppressive humidity and alien environment. The Force pressed on him from all sides, dark and light energies, mingling in ways that made clear perception difficult. Luke called out for Yoda, received no answer, began setting up camp in the gloom. A small creature appeared, green-skinned, pointed ears, barely 2 feet tall. It rummaged through Luke's supplies with manic energy, claiming various items, chattering about food and technology. Luke was annoyed, trying to retrieve his equipment, asking if the creature knew Yoda. The being claimed to know him, offered to take Luke to him, but insisted on eating first, testing Luke's patience with seemingly endless delays and diversions. Luke grew increasingly frustrated, unable to understand why this irritating creature was wasting his time when he needed to find the Jedi Master. Finally, he snapped, declaring he'd been training for a long time and didn't need these games. The small creature's demeanor changed. He spoke to Ben's Force ghost, who'd appeared nearby, complaining that Luke wasn't ready for training, that he was impatient, reckless, too old to begin properly. Luke realized with shock that this tiny, annoying creature was Yoda himself, the legendary Jedi Master he'd been seeking. His expectations, shaped by ideas of what a great warrior should look like, had blinded him to the truth. Yoda had been testing him from the moment he appeared, evaluating Luke's character, his patience, his willingness to look beyond surface appearances. Luke had failed the test, but Ben argued that Luke was their only hope, that he had to be trained despite his flaws. Yoda reluctantly agreed, warning that Luke would find training more difficult than he imagined. The training on Dagobah was grueling, challenging Luke physically, mentally, and spiritually. Yoda taught him to quiet his mind, to feel the Force flowing through all living things, to understand that size and physical strength were irrelevant compared to the power of the Force properly channeled. He made Luke run through the swamp carrying him on his back, perform acrobatic exercises while maintaining mental discipline, meditate for hours while Yoda lectured about Jedi philosophy. Every lesson aimed to break down Luke's preconceptions, to strip away the farm boy's naive understanding and replace it with genuine comprehension of what it meant to be a Jedi. One of the most significant lessons came when Luke's X-Wing sank completely into the bog. Luke tried to lift it using the Force, but gave up after minimal effort, claiming it was impossible, too big, too heavy. Yoda sighed with disappointment. "Size matters not," he explained. "Judge me by my size, do you?" The Force didn't distinguish between lifting a rock and lifting a starship. The only limitations were those Luke imposed through doubt and fear. To prove his point, Yoda closed his eyes, reached out with the Force, and lifted the entire X-Wing from the swamp, water streaming from its hull, moving it through the air with perfect control before setting it gently on shore. Luke stared in disbelief, stammering that he couldn't believe it. Yoda's response was simple and devastating. "That is why you fail." The cave on Dagobah tested Luke in ways physical training couldn't. The cave was strong in the dark side, a nexus of malevolent energy that created visions reflecting visitors' fears and inner darkness. Yoda sent Luke inside as part of his training, warning him to bring only his weapons, but knowing Luke would take his lightsaber despite the instruction. Inside the cave, Luke encountered a vision of Darth Vader, fought him, seemingly won by beheading the Dark Lord. But when the helmet exploded, Luke saw his own face inside, a warning that the line between Jedi and Sith was thin, that he carried the potential for darkness within himself, that he could become what he fought against if he gave in to fear and anger. The training was interrupted when Luke experienced visions of Han and Leia in pain, suffering, calling out for help. The images came through the Force, showing them in a city in the clouds, captured, tortured. Luke couldn't ignore them. He had to help his friends, had to try to save them even if it meant abandoning his training. Yoda and Ben both warned him it was a trap, that Vader was using his friends as bait, that leaving before his training was complete would be disastrous. Luke might fall to the dark side, might be killed, might join Vader and become another servant of the Emperor. But Luke couldn't stand by. He'd rather die trying to save his friends than live knowing he'd abandoned them. He left Dagobah against his master's wishes, flying toward Cloud City on Bespin, where Han, Leia, Chewbacca, and C-3PO, had fled seeking refuge with Han's old friend Lando Calrissian. Luke didn't know that Vader had arrived first, had tortured Han to draw Luke through their Force connection, had transformed Cloud City into a trap designed specifically to capture or corrupt the young Jedi. Luke walked into that trap willingly, knowing the danger, unable to do anything else. His capacity for self-sacrifice, for putting others before himself, was both his greatest strength and his most exploitable weakness. Vader was waiting in the carbon-freezing chamber, a facility designed for preserving Tibanna gas, but adaptable for freezing living beings. Han had already been frozen in carbonite and given to Boba Fett as payment for Jabba the Hutt, the crime lord Solo owed debts to. Leia, Chewbacca, and Lando watched helplessly from an observation platform as Luke entered the chamber. Vader emerged from the shadows, lightsaber ignited, offering Luke the chance to surrender peacefully. Luke ignited his own blade, the weapon that had belonged to his father, and attacked. The duel was one-sided. Vader was a master who'd spent decades perfecting his combat abilities, who'd killed countless Jedi, who understood fighting in ways Luke couldn't comprehend. Luke had raw talent, natural ability enhanced by Force sensitivity, and a few weeks of training with Yoda. It wasn't enough. Vader toyed with him, deflecting his attacks effortlessly, demonstrating the vast gap between Luke's current abilities and what he'd need to survive against true dark side masters. Vader drove Luke through the facility, forcing him backwards, eventually knocking him down a flight of stairs into the carbon-freezing chamber itself. Vader activated the freezing mechanism, attempting to capture Luke alive, as the Emperor wanted. But Luke escaped the chamber at the last second, the freezing process incomplete. The duel continued through the facility, Vader methodically dismantling Luke's defenses, injuring him, demonstrating superiority at every turn. They fought along narrow catwalks suspended over bottomless shafts, through control rooms and corridors, Vader relentlessly pursuing Luke through Cloud City's industrial complex. Finally, Vader used the Force to hurl objects at Luke, including heavy machinery, battering him with telekinetic attacks. One piece of equipment struck Luke's hand, causing him to drop his lightsaber, leaving him helpless. Vader cornered Luke at the end of a narrow catwalk extending over a massive shaft. Luke was defenseless, injured, unable to escape or continue fighting. Vader approached slowly, savoring the moment, preparing to make his offer. He revealed the truth that Obi-Wan had hidden. Vader hadn't killed Anakin Skywalker. He was Anakin Skywalker, Luke's father, transformed by the dark side into the Emperor's enforcer. The revelation shattered Luke's understanding of everything. Ben had lied. His father wasn't a murdered hero. His father was the greatest villain in the galaxy, responsible for the Jedi Purge, for billions of deaths, for the suffering that defined the age. Vader offered Luke his destiny. Join him, embrace the dark side, and together they would overthrow the Emperor and rule the galaxy as father and son. With their combined strength, they would bring order to the chaos, impose their will on the galaxy, remake everything according to their vision. The offer was everything Luke wanted, twisted into nightmare. He'd yearned to know his father, to connect with the man he'd never met. But not like this. Not as a monster. Not as a Sith Lord who'd murdered everything Luke believed in. Luke refused, screaming his denial, throwing himself backwards into the shaft, choosing possible death over joining his father in darkness. He fell down the shaft, barely catching himself on an antenna extending from the bottom of Cloud City. He hung there, suspended over the abyss, too injured to climb up, unable to save himself. Vader stood at the edge above, calling to him through the Force, urging him to give in, to accept his destiny. Luke refused, instead calling out telepathically to Leia. She heard him, felt his distress through the Force, convinced Lando to turn the Millennium Falcon around to rescue him. They retrieved Luke from the antenna just ahead of pursuing Imperial forces, fleeing Cloud City as Vader watched, his son escaping but now knowing the truth about his parentage. The revelation that Vader was his father haunted Luke during his recovery. The rebellion gathered at a rendezvous point, regrouping after the disasters at Hoth and Bespin. Luke had a cybernetic hand attached to replace the one Vader had severed, the mechanical prosthetic perfectly replicating natural movement, but serving as a constant reminder of his father and his own vulnerability. He confirmed with Ben's Force Ghost that the truth was real, that Obi-Wan had lied to protect him from knowledge he wasn't ready for. Ben explained that from a certain point of view, Anakin Skywalker had died when he became Vader, that the man Luke's father had been was destroyed by the dark side. Luke struggled to accept this, to separate the hero Anakin had been from the monster Vader had become. But something else emerged from the trauma of Bespin. Luke now knew his father lived, that Anakin Skywalker existed somewhere beneath Vader's armor. If that was true, if even a fragment of the good man remained, perhaps he could be saved. Perhaps redemption was possible even for someone who'd fallen so far. The idea took root in Luke's mind, a hope that seemed impossible but that he couldn't abandon. His father hadn't been murdered. His father could be rescued from the darkness that consumed him. It became Luke's new mission, more important than defeating the Empire or destroying the Sith. He would save Anakin Skywalker, redeem his father, prove that love was stronger than hatred, that light could overcome darkness. The following year saw Luke grow significantly in his Force abilities and his confidence as a rebel leader. He planned and executed the rescue of Han Solo from Jabba the Hutt's palace on Tatooine, demonstrating skills and strategic thinking that showed how far he'd come since leaving the planet years earlier. The rescue plan was complex, involving multiple infiltrations over weeks, gradually positioning allies inside Jabba's organization. Luke sent R2-D2 and C-3PO as gifts to Jabba, carrying his lightsaber hidden in R2's dome. Leia infiltrated disguised as the bounty hunter Boushh, bringing a frozen Han as her supposed captive. Luke arrived last, walking into Jabba's palace openly, using Jedi mind tricks and his growing reputation to intimidate the crime lord. When Jabba proved resistant to mind tricks, when the situation escalated to conflict, Luke demonstrated how thoroughly he'd changed. He escaped the Rancor pit by killing the creature with a steel gate dropped on its head, showing tactical thinking under pressure. When Jabba sentenced him, Han and Chewbacca to death at the Sarlacc pit, Luke executed his plan perfectly. He signaled R2-D2 to launch his lightsaber across the desert, caught it, ignited the blade, and carved through Jabba's guards with efficiency that spoke to months of additional training. The boy who'd struggled against Vader on Bespin had become a warrior capable of fighting multiple opponents simultaneously. He'd built a new lightsaber, green-bladed, constructed from knowledge gained through Obi-Wan's journal and Force visions. The weapon was his own creation, symbolizing his evolution from student to knight. After rescuing Han, after destroying Jabba's sail barge and freeing himself from his past on Tatooine, Luke returned to Dagobah. Yoda was dying, his 900-year life finally ending. Luke arrived in time for his master's final lessons, receiving wisdom about the Force, about his father, about the future. Yoda confirmed that Vader was indeed Anakin Skywalker, that he'd been more machine than man, twisted and evil. But he also confirmed there was another Skywalker, another hope if Luke should fail. Before Luke could ask who, Yoda died, his body disappearing as he became one with the Force, joining Ben as a Force ghost able to guide Luke from beyond death. Ben's spirit appeared and revealed the truth Luke had begun suspecting. Leia was his twin sister, separated at birth, hidden from Vader and the Emperor. The attraction Luke had felt was actually recognition of their blood, bond, the Force connecting them through familial love rather than romance. Ben explained that Luke would have to face Vader and the Emperor, that he couldn't avoid his destiny. Luke argued that he couldn't kill his own father, that there was still good in Anakin despite everything. Ben was skeptical, believing Vader was beyond redemption, that he'd been consumed by evil for too long. But Luke had faith, believed that love could save his father, that the spark of Anakin Skywalker could be rekindled if approached with compassion rather than hatred. The Battle of Endor was the rebellion's greatest gambit, an attempt to destroy the second Death Star while it was still under construction, eliminating the Emperor's new superweapon and hopefully killing Palpatine himself in the process. The plan required attacking the Death Star's shield generator on Endor's forest moon, using a small strike team to disable the shields, while the rebel fleet attacked the station itself. Luke volunteered for the strike team, knowing that Vader would sense his presence, that his father would come. He planned to confront Vader, to try one final time to reach the man his father had been, to offer redemption even to the most fallen. On Endor, surrounded by his friends, Luke confessed the truth to Leia. She was his sister. Vader was their father. Luke had to face him alone, had to try to save him, and he might not return. Leia understood, accepting the revelation with the strength that defined her, promising Luke that whatever happened, she believed in him. Luke surrendered himself to Imperial forces, was brought before Vader on the forest moon. The confrontation between father and son was painful, both trying to convince the other to change sides. Luke believed Anakin could be saved, that it wasn't too late. Vader believed Luke would join him, that seeing the Emperor's power would convince him to embrace the dark side. Neither convinced the other, and Vader brought Luke to the Death Star to face Palpatine. The throne room confrontation was Luke's ultimate test. The Emperor was there, ancient and twisted, radiating dark side power that made the air itself feel oppressive. Palpatine taunted Luke, revealed that the rebel fleet was walking into a trap, that the Death Star was fully operational despite appearances, that the shield generator on Endor was protected by an entire legion of the Emperor's best troops. Everything Luke's friends had planned for was anticipated. They would die, and Luke would watch, helpless to prevent it. The Emperor wanted Luke to give in to his anger, to attack in rage, to embrace the dark side through desperation and hatred. Luke resisted initially, refusing to fight, trusting in the Force and in his friends' ability to overcome the obstacles before them. But as the battle raged outside, as rebel ships died in explosions visible through the throne room windows, as the Emperor mocked him and his father stood silent, Luke's control wavered. Palpatine goaded him, suggesting that if Luke wouldn't turn, perhaps Leia could be corrupted instead, that she would make an excellent replacement apprentice. The threat to his sister broke Luke's restraint. He grabbed his lightsaber, attacked the Emperor in fury, was intercepted by Vader, and the duel between father and son began in earnest. This time Luke was stronger, faster, better trained. He'd learned from Dagobah, from his experiences over the past year, from his growing connection to the Force. He held his own against Vader, matching him strike for strike, defending against attacks that had overwhelmed him on Bespin. But he wasn't fighting to win. He was fighting defensively, trying not to harm his father, hoping to convince him through the duel itself that redemption was possible. He retreated upstairs to a catwalk, hiding in the shadows beneath the Emperor's platform, deactivating his lightsaber, refusing to continue fighting. Vader pursued him, probing Luke's thoughts through the Force, searching for leverage. He discovered Luke's feelings about Leia, realized Luke had a sister, understood she was strong in the Force. Vader spoke the threat aloud, suggesting that if Luke wouldn't turn, perhaps Leia would. If Luke couldn't be corrupted, maybe his sister could. The thought of Leia suffering as he had, of being twisted by the dark side, of losing herself to the Emperor's manipulation, detonated the last of Luke's control. He emerged from hiding in a fury, attacking with overwhelming aggression, channeling his rage and fear into devastating strikes. The assault drove Vader back, battered through his defenses, cut off his hand in a moment that mirrored Bespin. Vader fell before Luke, defeated, helpless. The Emperor urged Luke to kill him, to take Vader's place at Palpatine's side, to fulfill his destiny and become a Sith Lord. Luke stood over his father, lightsaber raised, darkness flowing through him, the power of his anger making him feel invincible. But then he looked at Vader's severed mechanical hand, looked at his own prosthetic hand, saw where the path led. He was becoming like Vader, letting rage control him, using the dark side even if he called it by other names. Luke deactivated his lightsaber and threw it away, the weapon clattering across the floor, a rejection of violence and darkness. He turned to the Emperor and declared himself a Jedi, like his father before him. He'd chosen the light side despite temptation, despite the cost, despite knowing what would come next. Palpatine's face twisted in fury. If Luke wouldn't serve, he would die. The Emperor unleashed Force lightning, blue-white energy arcing from his fingers, tearing through Luke's body with agony beyond description. Luke screamed, convulsed, his body shutting down under the assault. Palpatine mocked him, told him his faith in his father was his weakness, that he would die for his misplaced compassion. Luke called out to his father, begging for help, pleading for Anakin to save him. Vader stood watching, torn between decades of servitude to Palpatine and love for his son that had been buried, but never completely destroyed. The Emperor continued torturing Luke, declaring that the boy would die, that Vader would witness the end of the Skywalker line. But Luke's faith wasn't misplaced. His compassion wasn't weakness. It was strength, the power to reach someone everyone else had given up on, to believe in redemption when all evidence suggested it was impossible. Vader moved. He grabbed the Emperor, lifted him despite the Force lightning now coursing through his own body, destroying his armor's life support systems. Vader carried Palpatine to the edge of the reactor shaft and threw him down into the depths. The Emperor fell, screaming, his Force lightning dissipating, his reign ending in the reactor core of his own battle station. The prophecy of the Chosen One was fulfilled. Anakin Skywalker brought balance to the Force by destroying the Sith, eliminating both Palpatine and himself, ending the line of Darth Bane and the rule of two that had persisted for a millennium. But Anakin was dying. Luke dragged his father away from the reactor shaft, trying to save him, to get him to a ship before the Death Star exploded. Anakin asked Luke to remove his helmet, to let him see his son with his own eyes for the first and only time. Luke protested, knowing it would kill him without the life support. Anakin insisted. Luke carefully removed the mask, breaking the seals, revealing the scarred face beneath. Anakin looked at his son and smiled, the expression filled with peace. He told Luke he'd been right, that there had been good in him after all, that Luke had saved him. Then Anakin Skywalker died, redeemed in his final moments, returning to the light side after decades in darkness. Luke escaped the Death Star before it exploded, carrying his father's body, refusing to leave him behind. On Endor, as the rebellion celebrated their victory over the Empire, Luke burned Vader's armor in a funeral pyre, following Jedi tradition. He mourned alone, processing everything that had happened. He'd saved his father, but only for minutes, only long enough for Anakin to reject darkness and embrace light before death claimed him. It was victory and loss intertwined, the completion of Luke's journey to become a Jedi, and the permanent separation from the father he'd barely known. But later that night, during the celebration with his friends, Luke saw Force spirits. Ben Kenobi appeared, and Yoda and Anakin Skywalker, restored to his appearance before his fall, young and whole and free from the armor that had imprisoned him. They watched Luke with approval, with pride, with love. Anakin had transcended death, had learned to become one with the Force, had joined the Jedi who'd guided Luke throughout his journey. The sight gave Luke peace, confirmation that his faith hadn't been misplaced, that redemption was real, that love truly was stronger than hatred. The years following the Battle of Endor saw Luke work to rebuild the Jedi Order, a task that would define the rest of his life. The old order was extinct, its knowledge largely lost, its traditions broken. Luke had only fragments to work with. Obi-Wan and Yoda's teachings, ancient holocrons and texts he managed to recover, Force visions that showed him glimpses of how the Jedi had operated. He studied obsessively, traveling across the galaxy searching for Jedi artifacts and lore, piecing together an understanding of what the Order had been and what it might become. But Luke was also determined not to simply recreate what had existed before. The old Jedi Order had failed, had become so rigid and dogmatic that they couldn't adapt to the Sith's machinations, had fallen to Palpatine's schemes despite 900 years of Yoda's leadership. Their rules about attachment, their prohibition against love and family, had helped drive Anakin to darkness. Luke believed the Order needed to evolve, to learn from its failures, to create something better. He would teach students about the Force, train them in lightsaber combat and Jedi philosophy, but he would also allow them to have families, to form connections, to be fully human rather than detached monks serving abstract ideals. He established a Jedi temple on Ossus, a world that had once housed one of the Order's greatest academies before being devastated millennia ago. The location was symbolic, building new hope on the ruins of the old. Luke gathered students, Force-sensitive individuals he found across the galaxy, training them in what he'd learned, sharing knowledge that might otherwise have died with him. Among his students was his own nephew, Ben Solo, son of Han and Leia. Ben was strong in the Force, powerfully connected to the Skywalker bloodline, and Luke took responsibility for his training, believing he could guide his nephew to greatness, help him avoid the pitfalls that had destroyed Anakin. But Luke made mistakes, critical errors that would eventually destroy everything he'd built. He focused so intensely on teaching technique and philosophy that he didn't see the darkness growing in Ben. The boy was troubled, influenced by Snoke, a mysterious dark side user who'd been corrupting him from afar, whispering to him through the Force, exploiting his insecurities and his fascination with Darth Vader's legacy. Ben had learned he was Vader's grandson and became obsessed with his grandfather's power, viewing the Sith Lord as someone who'd achieved greatness rather than as a cautionary tale about the cost of falling to darkness. Luke didn't recognize the danger until it was nearly too late. One night, Luke entered Ben's sleeping quarters, sensing something wrong, probing his student's future through the Force. What he saw horrified him. Visions of death and destruction, of everything Luke loved being annihilated, of Ben becoming anew, Vader leading the dark side to victory over light. In a moment of pure instinct, Luke ignited his lightsaber, prepared to kill Ben in his sleep, to prevent the future he'd seen. It was pure reaction, driven by fear, lasting only seconds before Luke was overwhelmed by shame at what he'd almost done. But those seconds were enough. Ben woke, saw his master standing over him with an ignited weapon, believed Luke was trying to murder him. The betrayal was complete and devastating. Ben defended himself, used the Force to collapse the building on Luke, buried his uncle in rubble. Then he destroyed the temple, killed students who tried to stop him, took others with him to become the Knights of Ren. He fled to Snoke, embraced the dark side fully, took the name Kylo Ren, and became everything Luke had feared. The new Jedi Order was destroyed in a single night, Luke's decade of work undone by his own moment of weakness. Luke was consumed by guilt and shame. He'd failed Ben, failed the students who'd died, failed the Jedi tradition he'd tried to rebuild, failed Han and Leia who'd trusted him with their son. Worse, he'd failed because of the same fear that had corrupted his father, that had destroyed the old order. Fear had made him reach for his weapon. Fear had driven him to consider murdering his own nephew. Luke had become what he fought against, had let darkness into his heart despite everything he'd learned. The realization shattered him, destroyed his confidence, made him question everything he believed about the Jedi and his own place in the galaxy. He went into exile on Ahch-To, the ocean planet where the first Jedi temple had been built thousands of years earlier. The location was deliberate, a place to contemplate the origins of the Jedi, to understand where the Order had come from and where it had gone wrong. Luke cut himself off from the Force, deliberately suppressing his connection to avoid being found, to remove himself from the galactic struggles he believed he only made worse. He decided the Jedi should end, that the Order had caused more harm than good throughout history, that the galaxy would be better off without beings wielding such power and calling themselves guardians. Luke spent years on Ahch-To in isolation, living among the caretakers who maintained the ancient Jedi structures, fishing and farming for sustenance, meditating on his failures. He studied the ancient Jedi texts kept in a tree library near the temple, reading about the Order's earliest days, trying to understand what the Jedi had been before they became what they were in the prequels. He came to believe the Jedi's legacy was failure, that for all their power and knowledge, they'd been instruments of suffering, that the Force itself might be better served if those who called themselves Jedi simply stopped existing. His exile was interrupted by Rey, a scavenger from Jakku, strong in the Force, who'd been sent by Leia to find him and bring him back. The galaxy needed Luke Skywalker. The First Order, risen from the Empire's ashes, was conquering systems, spreading tyranny, threatening to plunge everything back into darkness. Kylo Ren led the First Order's forces, using his power to destroy the Resistance. Leia needed her brother. Rey needed a teacher. The galaxy needed hope. But Luke refused all of it, turned away from Rey, rejected his lightsaber when she offered it, insisted he'd come to Ahch-To to die, not to train more Jedi who would inevitably fail, as he had. Rey was persistent, following Luke around the island, demanding he train her, arguing that the galaxy needed the Jedi. Luke finally agreed to give her 3 lessons, not to train her as a Jedi, but to explain why the Jedi needed to end. The first lesson was about the Force itself, about how it didn't belong to the Jedi, how it was the energy between all things, not a power to be wielded by religious orders claiming special understanding. The second lesson was about the old Order's failure, how at the height of their power, the Jedi had allowed Darth Sidious to rise, create the Empire, and wipe them out. Their arrogance and dogma had blinded them to reality. But the third lesson was never delivered because Luke sensed something disturbing. Rey kept gravitating toward a dark side cave on the island, drawn to its power. When she explored it, Luke felt her descend without hesitation, without fear, touching darkness with ease that terrified him. Then he saw her and Kylo Ren communicating through a Force bond, a connection that transcended space, allowing them to see and speak to each other across the galaxy. Rey spoke of Ben Solo with compassion, with belief that he could be redeemed, exactly as Luke had once believed about Vader. But Luke saw it differently. He saw his mistakes repeating, saw Rey being seduced as he'd feared, saw history cycling endlessly through patterns of Jedi failing. Rey and Luke confronted each other. She demanded to know what happened with Ben, what Luke had done to drive his nephew to darkness. Luke confessed his moment of weakness, the seconds when he'd considered murdering Ben to prevent a dark future. Rey was horrified, but also determined, believing Luke's failures didn't doom her, that she could succeed where he'd failed. She told him Leia needed him, that there was still hope if he'd just stop hiding. Luke refused, and Rey left Ahch-To, taking the ancient Jedi texts with her, determined to face Kylo Ren herself, to try to turn him as Luke had once turned Vader. Luke was alone again, ready to burn the Jedi tree and the texts within, to destroy the last physical remnants of the Order. He carried a torch to the tree, prepared to ignite it, when Yoda's Force ghost appeared. The ancient master called down lightning from the sky, burning the tree himself, laughing at Luke's shocked reaction. Yoda told Luke that failure was the greatest teacher, that losing everything was necessary to understand what truly mattered, that Rey already had everything she needed from the texts because she'd taken them from the library before Luke could destroy them. Most importantly, Yoda told Luke to pass on what he'd learned, all of it, including his failures, because students needed to understand mistakes to avoid repeating them. The wisdom penetrated Luke's despair. He'd been wallowing in guilt, letting shame prevent him from continuing to help. But the galaxy still needed him. Leia still needed him. Rey needed him. Even Ben might need him, might be saved if approached with the right combination of compassion and accountability. Luke reconnected with the Force, feeling its flow through him again after years of deliberate suppression, feeling the web of connections between all living things. He sensed the battle occurring on Crait, where the Resistance was making their last stand against the First Order, where his sister was fighting desperately to buy time for escape, where everything would be lost if someone didn't intervene. Luke couldn't physically reach Crait in time. The planet was too far, the battle too immediate. But he'd learned techniques even Yoda hadn't mastered, had studied Force abilities in the ancient texts that demonstrated powers beyond conventional understanding. He centered himself, drew on the Force completely, and projected himself across the galaxy through pure will. It was Force projection, an ability so demanding that few Jedi in history had successfully performed it, requiring absolute control and consuming enormous energy. Luke created a duplicate of himself on Crait, visible and tangible to those present, able to interact with the physical world despite being thousands of light years away. His projection appeared before Leia, and they shared a moment of reconciliation. Luke apologized for failing her, for everything that had happened with Ben. Leia forgave him, understanding that guilt and shame had driven him into exile, but that he was here now when they needed him most. Luke gave her his father's dice from the Millennium Falcon, a symbol of family and connection, then walked out to face the First Order alone. He confronted Kylo Ren directly, his nephew ordering every weapon to fire on him, massive artillery bombardment that should have vaporized anyone caught in it. But when the smoke cleared, Luke stood unharmed, brushing dust from his shoulder with casual dismissal. Kylo approached him personally, igniting his lightsaber, attacking with rage and hatred. They dueled across the salt flats of Crait, Kylo's strikes passing through Luke without connecting, unable to harm him no matter how hard he tried. Luke apologized to Ben, told him he failed him, but also warned him that the war wasn't over, that this wasn't the end. He'd given the Resistance time to escape, fulfilled his purpose of buying them survival. As Kylo realized Luke wasn't physically present, that he'd been fighting a projection, Luke told him he'd see him around. The projection faded, Luke disappearing from Crait. On Ahch-To, Luke's physical body failed. The effort of projecting himself across the galaxy, of maintaining the illusion convincingly enough to fool everyone, including Kylo Ren, had drained him completely. He climbed to a cliff overlooking the ocean, watching the twin suns set over the water, their light reflecting off the waves in a scene that mirrored Tatooine from his youth. He'd come full circle, from a boy staring at twin suns dreaming of adventure, to a man who'd saved the galaxy multiple times, failed catastrophically, and finally found redemption by sacrificing himself for those he loved. Luke Skywalker became one with the Force, his body disappearing, his spirit transcending death to join Ben and Yoda and his father among the Force ghosts who guided the living. His sacrifice mattered. The Resistance survived. The spark of hope he'd protected lived on. Rey continued her journey, eventually defeating Palpatine when the Emperor returned in a cloned body, attempting to reclaim the galaxy. She took the name Rey Skywalker, honoring Luke's legacy, carrying forward the lessons he'd taught her through both his successes and failures. The Jedi didn't end as Luke had feared. They evolved, transformed by Rey's understanding and Luke's wisdom, becoming something new that learned from the past without being imprisoned by it. Luke's legacy extended far beyond his lifetime. He became a legend, a symbol of hope for generations who'd grown up under Imperial oppression. The story of the farm boy who became a Jedi, who destroyed the Death Star, who redeemed Darth Vader, inspired countless beings across the galaxy. Children played games pretending to be Luke Skywalker, fighting imaginary battles against the Empire. The legend sometimes exceeded the reality, turning Luke into a flawless hero rather than the complicated, flawed man he'd actually been. But the core truth remained. Luke Skywalker had mattered, had changed the galaxy through courage and compassion, had proven that even ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when guided by hope and love. His Force ghost appeared to Rey multiple times after his death, offering guidance and wisdom, helping her navigate challenges that might have overwhelmed her. He appeared alongside Leia when Rey faced Palpatine, their combined presence strengthening her, showing her that she wasn't alone, that the Skywalker legacy supported her. Luke had learned to manifest after death more completely than Obi-Wan or Yoda had managed, able to interact with the physical world in limited ways, lifting his X-Wing from Ahch-To's ocean so Rey could use it to reach Exegol. Even in death, Luke continued serving, helping, guiding, proving that the Force allowed consciousness to persist beyond physical existence. The philosophical implications of Luke's journey resonated across generations. His life demonstrated that heroes could fail, that failure didn't define them, that learning and growth came from mistakes rather than from constant success. Luke failed repeatedly throughout his journey. He failed to save Owen and Beru. He failed to complete his training with Yoda. He failed to redeem his father until the final possible moment. He failed Ben Solo catastrophically. But he also succeeded in ways that mattered most. He proved compassion could overcome hatred. He showed that faith in others' capacity for good, even when that faith seemed naive, could literally save souls from darkness. He demonstrated that sacrifice for those you love was the highest form of strength, not weakness. His relationship with the Force evolved throughout his life in ways that shaped Jedi philosophy going forward. Initially, Luke viewed the Force as a tool, something to be used for accomplishing goals. Yoda taught him it was more than that, an energy field connecting all living things, something to be understood and partnered with rather than simply wielded. Luke's exile forced him to confront the idea that the Force might not need the Jedi, that perhaps beings claiming special understanding of it caused more harm than good. His final actions showed him achieving synthesis, understanding the Force as both tool and partner, power and connection, something that enhanced life rather than something that required domination or submission. His combat abilities remained legendary long after his death. The duel with Vader on the Death Star, where Luke had ultimately defeated his father through combination of skill and letting go of hatred, became a teaching moment for Jedi studying lightsaber combat. Luke had mastered Form 5, Xian, and Gem So, the aggressive and defensive variants that emphasized powerful counterattacks and strength. But his true mastery came from emotional control, from fighting without letting anger dominate, from knowing when to attack and when to refuse violence entirely. His throwing away of his lightsaber in the Emperor's throne room, choosing compassion over power, demonstrated that true mastery wasn't about winning duels, but about winning the larger moral struggle. His construction of his second lightsaber, the green-bladed weapon he built between Empire and Return of the Jedi, represented his growth from student to master. He'd learned the technique from Obi-Wan's journal and from visions, constructed the weapon in isolation on Tatooine, bled the Kyber crystal to attune it to his Force signature. The process required understanding of both technology and the Force, combining mechanical skill with spiritual connection. The weapon served him for decades, eventually being passed to Rey after his death, continuing the tradition of lightsabers carrying meaning beyond their function as weapons. Luke's influence on his students, particularly Rey, shaped how the new generation understood what it meant to be a Jedi. He taught her about failure, about humility, about the danger of believing. You had all the answers? But he also taught her about hope, about the power of compassion, about fighting for others even when the odds seemed impossible. Rey synthesized these lessons with her own experiences, creating an approach to the Force that honored Luke's legacy while adapting to new challenges. She understood that being a Jedi meant constant growth, constant questioning, constant work to remain on the light side, rather than assuming righteousness came automatically with power. His relationship with Leia demonstrated that Force bonds between siblings were among the strongest connections in the galaxy. They'd been separated at birth, raised in completely different circumstances, yet instinctively understood each other, could sense each other's emotions and presence across vast distances. When Luke was in danger on Cloud City, Leia felt it and convinced Han to rescue him. When Luke projected himself to Crate, Leia knew immediately it was her brother despite years of separation. The bond suggested that family connections, particularly among Force sensitives, transcended normal limitations, creating ties that death itself couldn't completely sever. His redemption of Anakin Skywalker remained his greatest achievement, the accomplishment that defined his character and shaped galactic history. Obi-Wan and Yoda both believed Vader was beyond saving, that the man Anakin had been was truly dead. Luke refused to accept that, maintained faith that his father could be reached, that light could overcome darkness no matter how complete the corruption seemed. His faith was rewarded in the end, proving that redemption was always possible, that it was never too late to reject darkness and embrace light. The lesson resonated across the galaxy, inspiring countless beings to believe in second chances, to see the potential for good even in those who seemed utterly evil. But Luke's story also cautioned against naive optimism. His belief that Ben Solo could be saved, that patience and training would be sufficient, proved disastrously wrong. Ben needed more than Luke provided, needed recognition of his struggles and fears, needed connection rather than distant teaching. Luke's failure with Ben showed that compassion alone wasn't enough, that understanding and vigilance were also necessary, that believing in people's capacity for good didn't mean ignoring warning signs of darkness. The tragedy of Kylo Ren taught future Jedi that redemption was possible, but not guaranteed, that some would reject the light no matter how earnestly offered, that hope had to be balanced with wisdom. His final act of Force projection demonstrated mastery few Jedi ever achieved. The technique required such absolute control, such complete connection to the Force, that it was considered nearly legendary even in the Old Order's prime. Luke accomplished it despite never having been traditionally trained, despite cutting himself off from the Force for years, despite having far less instruction than Jedi of previous eras. The accomplishment spoke to his natural talent, his determination, his complete commitment to saving those he loved. It also cost him his life, the expenditure of energy so vast that his body couldn't survive it. Luke chose that sacrifice willingly, understanding the price, accepting death as the cost of giving hope one final chance. Standing before Luke Skywalker's complete legacy, examining his journey from farm boy to legend, to exile to final sacrifice, we see the arc of a hero in its purest form. Luke began as nobody special, a moisture farmer on a backwater planet dreaming of something more. He was thrust into adventure, discovered powers beyond his understanding, made mistakes and learned from them, achieved victories and suffered defeats, saved his father and the galaxy, failed his students, lost his way, and ultimately found redemption through sacrifice. His story teaches us that heroes are made through choices rather than destiny, that failure is part of growth, that compassion is strength rather than weakness, and that hope, no matter how fragile, is worth protecting even at the cost of everything. Luke Skywalker was never the most powerful Force user, never the best lightsaber duelist, never the wisest teacher. But he was the most human, the most relatable, the one who made mistakes we can understand and achieved victories we can aspire to. He showed us that ordinary people can become extraordinary, that the farm boy staring at twin suns can change the galaxy, that believing in others and refusing to give up on them can accomplish what power alone never could. His legacy lives on in every act of compassion, every refusal to give in to fear, every choice to believe in redemption rather than revenge. As long as beings remember his story, as long as they continue to hope despite darkness, Luke Skywalker remains alive through the Force, guiding and inspiring, proving that legends never truly die because they live on in those they've touched. Thank you for exploring the complete lore of Luke Skywalker with me. If you enjoyed this deep examination into one of Star Wars' most iconic and inspiring characters, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more comprehensive explorations of the characters, locations, and events that shape the galaxy far, far away. May the Force be with you, always.